At first, it feels like a mistake that can be corrected, a wrong angle, a late reaction, the kind of problem experience is supposed to fix. But then the wind keeps rising instead of stopping. The lake darkens in wide moving patches, and the boat begins to behave like something alive and frightened, leaning, shuddering, refusing to settle. And in that stretched second before everything gives way, they both realize the same unbearable truth. No one on shore is watching this part. No rescue boat is close enough to matter. And once the hull flips, there will be no clear line between minutes and hours. Only cold water. And the question of how long two people can stay alive when the lake decides not to let them leave. It was July 1974, late afternoon, on Lake Ontario near the Thousand Islands. The kind of summer day that begins gently and convinces people to trust it. Warm air over cool water, steady visibility, a breeze that felt useful rather than threatening. And when they pushed off earlier that day, it felt like borrowing time from something generous, not risky. Just two people. Mark Ellison at the tiller and his friend Paul Reeves forward, both in their 20s, both experienced enough to be calm but not experienced enough to be cautious about everything. The shoreline had faded into a low green strip behind them, and the nearest island looked close enough to reach without effort, which was part of the problem, because distance on open water lies quietly until it matters. The first sign wasn't the wind, it was the temperature, the air thinning, sharpening. Mark noticed it on his forearms, the way goosebumps rose without cold yet. Paul noticed it in the sound, the lake going quieter, flatter, as if drawing breath. They exchanged a look but didn't speak, because nothing had technically gone wrong. The sail still held shape, the rudder still answered, and the sky, while darker to the west, wasn't dramatic enough to demand retreat. The radio they'd left in the car had mentioned scattered storms earlier, nothing organized, nothing urgent, and that false calm bought them minutes they didn't realize they were spending. When the squall hit, it arrived sideways, not downward, the wind accelerating in steps instead of one blow, 10 knots becoming 20, then more. The boat heeling hard. Mark spilling air from the sail, Paul shifting weight, water beginning to slap the hull instead of slide under it. And then the gust that changed everything, sharp, localized, a sudden force that caught the sail before Mark could react fully, the mast jerking, the hull lifting, and the world rotating just enough to steal balance. The boat rolled. Not violently, just decisively, like something finished arguing. Cold swallowed them instantly. Lake Ontario in July still holding winter in its depth, the shock-tightening breath. Mark's first instinct was to swim. Then he stopped himself, grabbed the hull, felt solid resistance, fiberglass slick but real. Paul surfaced on the other side, coughing once, then clamping his jaw shut, both of them wearing life vests that now mattered more than anything else they owned. The overturned boat rocking between waves, sail dragging beneath like an anchor, the wind continuing to build. And as Mark pressed his forehead briefly against the hull to steady himself, he understood that the problem was no longer the weather itself, but how long they could think clearly inside it. Because the lake was wide, the shoreline no longer close, and the squall showed no interest in passing quickly. The first decision came fast and felt wrong no matter which way it leaned. Try to right the boat now while energy was still high, or stay with it low and stable while the wind punished everything upright. Mark counted breaths instead of seconds, forcing his chest to loosen, knowing panic burned heat faster than cold did. Paul stayed silent, not from fear, but from calculation, his hands gripping the centerboard edge just under the surface, testing how much resistance it still had. The waves were short and steep now, stacking on each other, slapping the hull hard enough to rattle through bone, and every impact reminded them that this thin shell was still floating, which meant abandoning it would be the worst mistake possible. So they stayed pressed close, shoulders against fiberglass, letting the boat shield them from the wind on one side, even as water climbed their sleeves and soaked into seams that were never meant to be underwater this long. They tried to right the boat once, not fully, just a controlled lift. Mark pulling, Paul pushing, timing it between gusts. and for half a breath the mast rose. The hull shifted. Hope flared. Then the wind caught the sail still submerged and dragged everything back down. The effort cost them strength. They could feel leaking away, forearms burning, fingers stiffening. So they stopped, deliberately, agreeing without words that trying again too soon would only turn effort into exhaustion. Instead, they focused on smaller things, checking each other's faces, flexing hands, keeping knees moving. Paul adjusted the line tangled near the rudder, freeing it slowly so it wouldn't act like a leash later. Mark scanned the water constantly, counting waves, watching their rhythm, because patterns meant predictability, and predictability was the only kind of control left. The squall did not ease, it widened, the wind flattening the surface into dark streaks, rain joining sideways, stinging eyes, erasing the horizon, islands disappearing into gray, and with them any sense of direction. Mark realized with a quiet jolt that shouting would be useless now. Sound ripped away instantly, so they leaned close, foreheads nearly touching when they spoke, conserving voice and focus. Paul suggested staying with the hull until the gusts weakened. Mark agreed, but worried about drift, the lake pushing them farther from shore with every minute, an invisible conveyor belt, and yet swimming was unthinkable. Cold, tightening muscles already, distance deceptive, so they chose the only option left. Patience with purpose, watching the sky for breaks, saving strength, waiting for the moment when the lake might briefly loosen its grip, knowing that missing that window could mean waiting much longer. And as another wave broke over the hull and slid down their backs, both understood that survival now depended less on bravery and more on timing. And timing was something neither of them could control, only recognize. Time stopped behaving normally. It stretched and folded, minutes feeling thick and heavy. Mark noticed it first in his hands, how they no longer felt cold in a sharp way, but dull, like touching something through cloth, which frightened him more than the initial shock had, because numbness pretends to be relief. Paul noticed it in his legs, how keeping them moving required conscious effort now, no longer automatic. And they spoke about it quietly, not dramatically, just stating facts, because naming the problem made it manageable. Mark shifted his grip, forcing blood back into his fingers, slapping the hull lightly to keep sensation alive. Paul rotated his shoulders, counting each movement, refusing to let stillness settle in. The boat rocking constantly, never letting them fully rest, never letting them forget where they were. The wind shifted slightly, not weaker, just different, and that change brought new danger. Waves now struck the hull at an angle, lifting it unevenly, threatening to roll it again. Mark wrapped one arm through a line for security, careful not to entangle himself. Paul adjusted his position to counterbalance, both of them learning the boat's new language moment by moment. Rain mixed with spray, water creeping into collars, soaking layers that were meant to dry in air, not water. And Mark felt the slow drain of warmth accelerating, each wave stealing a little more. He thought briefly about shore, about how close it had seemed earlier, then forced the thought away, because imagining land made the water feel deeper, more endless. A sound cut through the wind, faint but unmistakable. An engine somewhere far off. Both heads snapped up, eyes straining. Mark raised an arm instinctively, then lowered it. Realizing how small a gesture that was in this weather, Paul shouted once, the word torn apart instantly, leaving nothing behind. The sound faded, and the silence that followed was worse, because it carried hope with it when it left. Mark closed his eyes for a second, steadying himself, reminding himself that false hope could be as dangerous as despair. They needed a plan that didn't depend on being seen quickly. They chose the hardest option, wait longer, but prepare to act fast. Mark watched the wave sets, noticing a slight spacing change, the gusts coming in pulses now instead of a constant shove. Paul pointed it out too, relief flickering between them, because agreement meant clarity. They rehearsed the motion in words, when to pull, when to lean, when to stop if it failed. conserving energy for one decisive attempt instead of many wasted ones. The lake still loud, still hostile, but no longer completely unpredictable. And as Mark tightened his grip and braced his feet against the hull, he understood something important. Survival wasn't about beating the lake. It was about waiting for the exact moment when it stopped actively trying to throw them back, even if only for seconds, and not hesitating when that moment finally arrived. They waited through 3 more wave sets, counting silently, letting the lake show its pattern. Mark whispering numbers under his breath. Paul nodding when the timing matched what he felt through the hull. The wind still strong, but no longer chaotic, coming in bursts with short, fragile gaps between them. And when the next lull arrived, it felt thinner than they wanted, but better than nothing. Mark gave a single sharp word, and they moved together. Not rushing, not hesitating. Paul climbing onto the centerboard with careful pressure. Mark pulling the line with everything he had left. The mast lifting inch by inch, water pouring from the sail in heavy sheets. The hull rotating toward something that almost looked like upright again, and for a moment it worked. The boat balanced on a knife edge, neither floating nor fallen, and then a late gust slammed into the exposed sail, twisting it sideways, wrenching the hull back down hard enough to knock the air from Mark's lungs. The failure immediate and absolute. Fiberglass slapping water, their bodies dragged with it, the effort burning strength they could not get back. They clung there afterward, breathing hard, letting the disappointment pass without naming it, because naming it would make it heavier. Paul's hands shook now, not violently, but enough to notice. Mark saw it and adjusted positions, pressing closer so they could share what little shelter the hull offered. The cold had settled deeper, no longer shocking, just constant. A pressure that dulled thought and slowed reaction. And Mark forced himself to speak, asking simple questions, keeping Paul engaged, keeping both of them present, because silence invited drifting thoughts, and drifting thoughts led to bad decisions. The rain easing slightly, but the wind refusing to fully let go. The lake still pushing them farther from any imagined shore, each wave carrying them a little more into open water. They took inventory again, not of gear, but of themselves, fingers stiff but moving, legs responsive though heavy, breathing controlled, fear contained. And that mattered, because as long as those things held, they still had options. Mark noticed the clouds thinning to the east, a subtle lightening that could mean the squall was stretching out rather than intensifying. Paul followed his gaze and nodded, cautious but encouraged. They agreed to wait longer before trying again, not because waiting felt good, but because rushing now would waste what little coordination they had left. The boat rocking steadily, almost gently by comparison, and in that uneasy pause Mark realized something that sharpened his focus instead of dulling it. The lake had not beaten them yet. It had only forced them to slow down, and as long as they could keep choosing carefully instead of reacting blindly, survival was still an active process, not a fading hope. The next change came quietly, almost politely. The wind easing just enough to feel suspicious, the waves lengthening instead of breaking, their tops smoothing out as if the lake were tired of shouting. Mark felt it first through the hull, the impact softer, more spaced. Paul felt it through the centerboard, the resistance changing, less violent, more predictable, and they shared a look that carried both hope and caution, because this was the kind of moment that punished impatience. The cold still wrapped around them, heavy and persistent. Their movements slower now, not weak, but deliberate, as if every action had to pass through an extra layer of thought before becoming motion. Mark noticed his jaw aching from clenching it unconsciously, forced himself to relax, to keep blood moving. Paul stamped his feet lightly against the hull. Small motions, constant reminders to stay awake inside his body. They prepared again, but differently this time, not rushing toward the dramatic act of righting the boat, instead adjusting small things first. Mark freed a line that had begun to tighten under tension, knowing it could snag later. Paul repositioned himself so his weight would come on smoothly rather than all at once. They spoke through the steps softly, almost calmly, repeating the order. Not because they might forget, but because saying it anchored them. The lake still unfriendly, but no longer actively trying to tear the boat from their hands. Rain thinning into mist, the horizon reappearing in fragments, islands returning as dark shapes instead of rumors. And with that came a new pressure. Visibility meant possibility, but also meant they could be seen drifting farther from where help might expect them to be. They tried again when the next lull came, not waiting for perfection, knowing it wouldn't arrive. Mark pulling steady instead of hard, Paul applying weight gradually, the hull responding, slow but obedient. The mast lifting higher than before, water cascading off the sail in heavy sheets, the boat rolling toward upright with a stubbornness that felt almost human. Mark's arms shaking now, not from fear, but from fatigue. Paul gritting his teeth, focusing on balance instead of speed. And for a moment it seemed like it might work. The hull nearly vertical, the centerboard biting, the sail clearing the surface. And then the boat stalled, hovering between states, neither overturned nor free, demanding more strength than they could give all at once. They held it there longer than felt possible, muscles screaming quietly, breath shallow, the lake rocking them as if testing resolve. And Mark made a decision that felt dangerous but necessary. He eased off slightly instead of forcing it, letting the hull settle back just a fraction, preserving energy, choosing not to lose everything on a single desperate push. The boat sank back, but not fully. Resting again on its side, closer to upright than before, progress measured in inches instead of victories. Paul exhaled slowly, nodded, accepting the choice without argument, because survival now was no longer about dramatic success. It was about incremental gains, about not crossing the line where effort turned into collapse. And as they clung there, shivering but alert, both understood that they were closer than they had been at any point since the squall hit. Not safe yet, not rescued, but no longer completely at the lake's mercy, which made the waiting that followed even harder to endure. The cold stopped feeling like an enemy and started feeling like a rule, something constant that could not be argued with, only managed. Mark noticed it in the way his thoughts came slower, not wrong, just delayed, like a radio signal passing through interference. Paul noticed it when his teeth began to chatter in short, controlled bursts he couldn't fully stop, and they acknowledged it out loud, because pretending it wasn't happening would give it power. Mark suggested resetting their positions again, changing contact points to wake numb muscles. Paul agreed, shifting his grip, forcing his hands to open and close, the simple act painful but necessary. The lake now rolling instead of striking, waves long and heavy, lifting them and setting them down like slow breathing. The wind reduced to a steady push rather than a shove, which should have been comforting, but instead created a new threat. Drift, quiet, relentless movement away from familiar water. They tried to estimate how far they'd moved, but without landmarks it was guesswork. Islands sliding past at angles that made distance hard to judge. Mark pointed out one low shape he thought he recognized. Paul wasn't sure, and they let it go, because arguing burned energy. Instead, they focused on what could still be controlled: posture, breathing, grip. Mark loosened one strap on his vest to relieve pressure on his chest. Paul tightened his hood to reduce heat loss from his neck. Small adjustments, but each one bought minutes, maybe more. The sky brighter now, the rain mostly gone, but the wind still refusing to die completely, as if it wanted to see how this would end. Another attempt felt possible, but risky. Fatigue sat deeper now, hiding strength behind stiffness. They talked through it carefully, agreeing that this would be the last try for a while, no matter the outcome, because repeated failure could break more than muscles. Mark watched the waves again, waiting for a lull long enough to matter. Paul braced himself mentally, reminding his legs they still worked. When the moment came, it wasn't dramatic. Just a subtle easing, Mark called it. They moved slower than before, more controlled. The mast rising, Water shedding. The hull responding reluctantly but consistently. The boat reaching that familiar suspended balance point again. And this time holding it, seconds stretching, muscles trembling, Mark urging gently, not forcing, Paul adjusting weight by inches. And then, with no clean victory moment, the boat tipped past the point of no return and settled upright, wobbling, unstable, but floating the right way up. They didn't celebrate. There was no room for it, because survival wasn't over. The sails still heavy with water, the cockpit flooded, the boat barely under control. Mark scrambled aboard first, clumsy, stiff. Paul followed, movements slow, deliberate. They collapsed low to keep balance, hearts pounding, breath ragged, the lake still cold, still wide. But something fundamental had changed. They were no longer clinging, they were riding again. Even if poorly, even if briefly. And as Mark reached for the bailer with shaking hands, both understood that this was not rescue, not even safety, just a narrow ledge between danger and possibility. And they would have to hold it carefully, because one mistake now could undo everything they had fought for. Getting the boat upright did not mean getting away. It only meant trading one kind of danger for another. The cockpit sloshed with heavy water, every shift sending it rushing side to side, threatening to pull the hull back into instability. Mark worked the bailer in slow, mechanical strokes, arm protesting with each movement. Paul stayed low, bracing with his legs, using his body as ballast. The sail hung limp and wrong, too heavy to catch wind cleanly, too light to justify risking a full hoist, and the lake, now calmer but not forgiving, rolled beneath them with a patience that felt deliberate, each wave testing whether they truly belonged on top of it, or whether it would get another chance to reclaim them. They spoke little, saving breath, communicating with gestures and short phrases, Mark pointing, Paul nodding, the simplest language possible, because complexity led to mistakes. The shoreline was visible now, but not comforting. Islands layered in gray and blue, distances still deceptive, Paul suggested, angling toward the nearest dark shape. Mark hesitated, calculating drift, wind, their remaining strength, choosing not the closest land but the most forgiving approach, lee side rather than open fetch, the decision costing time but saving energy. They adjusted the sail partially, just enough to give steerage without inviting another knockdown. The boat responding sluggishly, but responding, and that mattered more than speed. Fatigue crept in again, quieter this time, more dangerous. Mark noticed his focus narrowing too much, vision tunneling, forced himself to look up, scan, reorient. Paul noticed his own hands trembling as he held a line steady, adjusted grip, wrapped it once more around his wrist for security, careful not to trap himself. The bailer kept moving, water level slowly dropping. Each inch gained felt earned, hard, real. The lake no longer roaring, but still cold, still vast, still capable of ending this if they grew careless. And as they inched forward, boat heavy, bodies heavier, both men understood that survival had shifted again. It was no longer about enduring the water. It was about staying sharp enough to not give the lake an excuse to take them back. Progress was real now, but it was slow in a way that felt cruel. The kind of movement that demanded constant attention without offering reassurance. The boat crept forward, bow lifting and falling, the sail finally shedding enough water to hold a weak but usable shape. Mark steering with exaggerated care, avoiding sharp corrections that could destabilize them. Paul continuing to bail, arms burning, rhythm steady, each scoop a small refusal to give in. The lake rolling beneath them with long, patient swells that no longer crashed but never stopped either. And that steadiness was deceptive, because it lulled the mind, tempted it to relax too much, and both of them fought that urge consciously, reminding each other to stay alert, to keep checking wind direction, wave angle, balance. The nearest island grew slowly larger, its shape resolving from a dark smear into trees and rock. But distance on water plays tricks, and the approach seemed to stall the closer they got. Mark adjusted their angle again, choosing a wider arc to avoid a rocky point that could tear the hull if they misjudged the swell. Paul noticed the change and trusted it without debate. Their teamwork now stripped down to essentials. No ego, no second-guessing, just survival logic. The cold still present, still draining but no longer overwhelming, replaced by a deep, bone-level exhaustion that made every task feel heavier than it should have been. A new problem emerged quietly, the wind fading unevenly, dropping in patches, leaving them momentarily underpowered. The sail fluttering uselessly before filling again, each lull costing momentum they could not easily regain. Mark compensated by steering with the waves instead of against them, letting the lake help when it would. Paul shifted his weight subtly to keep the hull trimmed, the bailer finally resting as the cockpit cleared enough to risk it, their hands trembling when they paused, muscles complaining loudly now that they were no longer in constant crisis mode, and that pause was dangerous because pain invited rest, and rest invited mistakes. They spoke again, brief, practical, agreeing on the final approach. No sudden moves, no shortcuts, even if land looked close enough to reach in one last push, because that last push was where people lost control. The island's lee side promised calmer water, protection from what wind remained, but reaching it required patience. They barely had left. The sun lowering behind thinning clouds, light shifting, shadows lengthening, and with it, a new pressure. Night would make everything harder, colder, more uncertain. Mark felt that urgency like a weight on his chest, but he forced it down, choosing steadiness over speed, because the lake had punished every rushed decision so far, and as the hull rose and fell, edging closer to shelter, both men understood that they were no longer simply surviving the lake. They were negotiating with it, step by careful step, hoping it would allow them to finish what they had started before the light ran out. The water changed first, smoothing out as they crossed into the island's shadow, the waves losing their height, their sharpness, becoming long, manageable rolls instead of constant threats. And that shift brought relief that was almost dangerous, because relief made the body want to stop. Mark felt it immediately, his shoulders sagging, his grip loosening for a second before he corrected it. Paul felt it too, knees trembling as the effort finally caught up, and they reminded each other aloud. Not safe yet, not finished, because this was the stretch where people misjudged distance and strength, where grounding too hard or turning too sharply could undo everything they had clawed back from the lake. The wind, blocked by trees and rock, became inconsistent, curling and twisting, sometimes filling the sail just enough to help, sometimes pushing from the side without warning. Mark adjusted constantly, steering with small, precise movements, refusing to overcorrect. Paul shifted his weight to match, muscles responding slower now, but still responding. The shoreline close enough to see detail, individual trees, uneven rock faces, but still far enough that swimming it would be a gamble neither of them could afford. The sun sinking lower, light thinning, the lake cooling again with evening, and that creeping chill reminded them that time was still an enemy. They aimed for a narrow strip of darker water near a rocky outcrop, where the waves broke less aggressively, Mark choosing it because it offered the calmest approach, not the easiest landing. Paul braced for contact, ready to jump only when told, not early, not late, every instruction deliberate, the boat gliding in, slower now, painfully slow, the sail losing wind entirely at the worst moment, leaving them drifting, Mark using the rudder to keep them aligned, Paul leaning forward, reaching with one foot, then pulling it back when it found nothing but cold water, waiting, and then the hull bumped rock gently. Not a crash, just a solid, undeniable touch. Paul moved first, carefully, planting a foot, testing weight, then another. Mark holding the boat steady as long as he could, until the hull scraped again and settled. They both exhaled at the same time, not in celebration, but in release, because the hardest part wasn't standing on land. It was knowing they would stay there. Paul grabbed the bowline and secured it around a low tree, hands clumsy but determined. Mark followed, legs weak, balance uncertain, but upright. Both of them standing on wet rock, shivering violently now that the water no longer held them up. The boat floating safely beside them, damaged but intact. They didn't move far, just enough to get clear of the edge, collapsing onto stone, backs against each other for warmth. The lake still moving, still vast, but no longer in control. Mark stared out at it, chest rising and falling hard, realizing how close they had come to not making this final stretch. Paul closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, forcing himself to stay awake, because survival wasn't finished yet. Night was coming. Help was not guaranteed, and while they had escaped the water, they still had to endure what came next before this could truly end. The island was quiet in a way that made sound feel risky. Wind moving through trees above them, water whispering against rock. Mark and Paul sitting close, knees drawn up, bodies shaking now that motion had stopped. The cold reclaiming ground quickly, Mark forcing himself to move, because stillness would take more than it gave. He helped Paul strip the wet outer layer, wrung it as best he could, then put it back on, damp but better than dripping. They stayed low, using the overturned sail as a crude windbreak, backs pressed together to share warmth, speaking in short sentences, checking awareness, names, simple questions, anything to keep their minds anchored. The light fading to a thin gray that flattened the world, turning the lake into a sheet of dull metal, the boat tugging gently at its line like it wanted to leave again. They had no flares, no radio, no certainty that anyone knew exactly where they'd ended up. But they did have visibility now, and that mattered. The island sitting close to common sailing routes, Mark remembered that, said it out loud, not as reassurance, but as fact. Paul nodded, conserving energy. And when the engine sound returned, it almost blended into imagination at first. Low, distant, then steadier, approaching, both of them freezing, listening hard, afraid to believe too quickly. The sound growing clearer, purposeful, cutting across the water in a straight line instead of drifting. Mark stood carefully, legs protesting, waved an arm once, then again, not shouting, saving strength. The engine pitch changed, slowed, a shape separating itself from the darkening water. The rescue boat came around the island's edge cautiously, spotlight sweeping, pausing, then locking onto them. The beam harsh and unreal. Voices carrying across the short distance, clear, human, asking if they were all right. Mark answering immediately, steady despite the shake in his chest. Yes, 2 people, cold, boat secured. The relief that followed was heavy and disorienting, almost harder to manage than fear had been, because now the body wanted to collapse completely. The crew moved efficiently, practiced, lines thrown, instructions calm. Paul helped aboard first, then Mark, both wrapped in dry blankets, hands gripping the rail as if it might vanish, the island receding as the engine turned them back toward light and structure and warmth. As the boat accelerated, Mark looked once more at the dark water, at how ordinary it appeared again. No sign of what it had taken from them or nearly taken away. Paul leaned back, eyes closed now, finally allowing himself to stop calculating, stop watching. The rescue crew speaking softly, checking vitals, offering warm drinks. The simple kindness grounding them more than heat. And as the shoreline lights grew brighter, Mark understood something clearly. Survival hadn't been about strength or luck alone. It had been about refusing to rush, refusing to quit, making one careful choice after another until the lake no longer had the final say. And when the boat eased into the dock and solid ground waited beneath their feet, the month, the hour, the storm, all of it collapsed into one quiet truth. They were still here, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.